3 days before my father's funeral, my stepmother slid a folder across the kitchen table and told me to sign wherever she'd placed the little yellow tabs. She said it was just paperwork, estate stuff. Grief makes everything so complicated, she added, and her voice was exactly soft enough to make me feel guilty for hesitating. I almost signed. Then I remembered the camera. My name is Claire Holt, and I'm 29 years old. I teach 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary in a small city in Ohio where everyone either grew up together or married into someone who did. I mention that because it matters. In a town like ours, reputation is currency, and my stepmother Renee had spent 4 years building one that could have bought anything. She married my father Gerald 18 months after my mother passed. I don't say that to frame her as a villain from the start. Grief does strange things to people, and my father was the kind of man who needed someone beside him to function. He was warm and generous and completely helpless with anything that involved paperwork or planning. That's what made him such an easy target. I had installed the camera 2 weeks before he died. Small thing, no bigger than a smoke detector, tucked on the bookshelf in the living room between a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird and a ceramic owl my mother had made in a pottery class the year before she got sick. I'd put it there because things had been going missing. Small things at first. My mother's pearl earrings from the guest room where I stayed on weekends, a set of silver serving spoons that had been in our family for 3 generations. When I mentioned it to my father, he got quiet in a way that told me he already knew something was wrong but wasn't ready to name it. So I ordered the camera online. It connected to an app on my phone and backed up automatically to cloud storage. It was motion activated, and the resolution was sharp enough to read the spines of books on a shelf across the room. I told myself it was just to keep an eye on things while I was at school during the week. I told myself I'd probably never need it. My father died on a Tuesday morning in late October. Natural causes, the paramedics said. His heart, which had been giving him trouble for 2 years, had finally given out. Renee found him in his armchair at 6 in the morning when she came downstairs. She called 911. And by the time my brother Daniel and I got there, the house already felt like it belonged to someone else. The camera was still on the shelf. Renee hadn't noticed it. Why would she? She'd never been the kind of person who noticed things that weren't about her. I didn't check the footage right away. I was grieving. I was teaching half days and crying in my car during my lunch break and trying to figure out how to write a eulogy for a man who had been my whole world and my greatest disappointment all at once. It wasn't until Renee handed me that folder 3 days before the funeral that something shifted in my chest. A coldness. A clarity. She'd highlighted my name on at least a dozen pages. I recognized a few of the document types from when my parents had refinanced the house years ago. But one page near the back stopped me. It listed me as co-borrower on a home equity line of credit for $180,000 that I had never seen before. My signature was already on it, dated 6 months ago. I hadn't signed anything 6 months ago. I hadn't been asked. I set the folder down and told Renee I needed some time to look things over. She smiled and said of course and brought me a cup of tea. I didn't drink. That evening, I drove home, sat at my kitchen table, and opened the camera app on my phone. The cloud had everything. 72 hours of motion-triggered clips going back 2 weeks. Most of it was ordinary. My father reading, Renee watching television, the housekeeper vacuuming on Thursday. I almost stopped watching after the first hour. Then I got to the clip from 11 days ago, a Thursday night at 11:47, and I stopped breathing. Renee was at the desk in the corner of the living room, the one where my father kept his files. Her son Marcus was standing behind her, and between them on the desktop were papers I recognized as estate documents. She had a pen in her hand and she was practicing a signature, my father's signature, over and over, on the blank lines of what looked like a deed transfer. Marcus kept leaning in, pointing, saying things I could hear clearly because the camera's microphone was better than I'd realized. "The notary won't question it," he said. "We used the same one for the Kellerman account and she never blinked." "This is the last piece," Renee said. "Once this transfers, everything flows through the trust. She gets her teacher's salary and a sad little wave goodbye." She was me. I watched the clip 4 times. Then I called my brother. Daniel is 34 and works in IT security for a logistics company in Columbus. He drove to my apartment at midnight without asking questions, which is the kind of brother he is. He watched the footage with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and when it ended he was quiet for a long time. "How many clips are there?" he asked. "I haven't gone through all of them. We go through all of them. Tonight, we sat at my kitchen table until 3 in the morning. By the time we were done, we had pulled 17 clips showing Renee or Marcus at that desk, working through documents, making phone calls, and once, at 2 in the morning on the Saturday before my father died, having a conversation that made both of us go completely still. "The dosage wasn't enough the first time," Marcus said. He was pacing. Renee sat in my father's chair. "It was enough," she said. Dr. Albright already noted the irregular rhythms at the last appointment. When it happens, no one asks questions about a man with a documented heart condition. And the insurance? Paying out within 60 days. Both policies, the one he knew about and the one he didn't. Daniel reached over and paused the clip. He looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us said anything for a moment, because some things are too large to put into words the first time you understand them. "We're not going to the police yet," he said finally. "Daniel, not until we know what we're dealing with. I need to see what she's filed, what she's forged, what name she's put you under. If we walk into a police station with just these clips, they can challenge the chain of custody, claim you staged it. We need everything." He was already pulling up a legal pad. "First thing tomorrow, you and I are going to every public record office in this county." I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark and thought about my father in his armchair on a Tuesday morning, and I thought about what dosage meant, and I thought about how the tea Renee had brought me that evening sat untouched on my kitchen counter, and I was very glad it did. The county recorder's office opened at 8:30. Daniel met me outside with 2 coffees and a list. We spent 4 hours working through property records, business filings, and loan applications. What we found was worse than either of us had imagined. Renee had been busy long before my father's health declined. There were 3 LLCs registered in my father's name that he'd never mentioned to either of us, all formed within the last 2 years, all listing a P.O. box in a neighboring county as their business address. 2 of them had already been dissolved after defaulting on equipment loans. The third was still active, and it listed me as a 30% partner. I had never heard of it. I had certainly never agreed to be a partner in anything. There were also credit applications bearing my name and signature going back 14 months, a personal loan for $40,000, 2 credit cards with combined limits of $35,000, a vehicle loan for a truck I had never seen. Every monthly payment had been made on time, right up until 3 months ago, when they all stopped simultaneously. My credit, which I had spent years carefully maintaining on a teacher's salary, had been destroyed without my knowledge. The clerk who helped us, a quiet woman named Beverly who'd worked in that office for 20 years, watched us stack papers and said nothing until we were nearly done. Then she leaned across the counter and said, low and without fuss, "Whatever you've found, make copies of everything before you leave. Sometimes people call ahead." We thanked her and did exactly that. Daniel had already called an attorney he'd worked with during a contract dispute the year before. Her name was Priya Shetty, and she specialized in fraud and estate litigation. She agreed to see us that afternoon, and she spent 2 hours with the documents spread across her conference table, asking sharp questions and writing in a legal pad in handwriting so small and precise it looked like code. "The forgeries are systematic," she said when we finished. "This isn't someone who panicked and tried one thing. This is a person who studied how to do this. The signatures on the loan documents are very close. Not perfect, but close enough that a bank loan officer wouldn't question them. The LLCs are a classic asset shielding structure. If your father had died without anyone looking closely, everything would have flowed through those entities and she would have dissolved them inside 6 months." "What about the conversation on the recording?" I asked. "About the dosage." Priya set down her pen. "That goes to the district attorney's office. That's not civil, that's criminal." She looked at both of us. "But I want you to understand what you're starting. Once this is in motion, your stepmother will know immediately. She has Marcus, and Marcus has shown he's comfortable moving money and helping cover tracks. You need to be careful." "Can we freeze the estate?" Daniel asked. "I can file an emergency motion today. Given the evidence of forgery, a judge will grant it. She won't be able to transfer any assets, access the bank accounts, or execute any of those documents she wanted Claire to sign." Priya picked up her phone. I'm also going to call someone at the county DA's office. I went to law school with the assistant district attorney. She'll want to see this recording. We left her office with a case number and a set of instructions. Don't contact Renee. Don't remove anything from the house. Document every call, every message, every contact. And wear the emergency protective app Daniel had already downloaded on my phone that would send my GPS location to him with one press. That evening, Renee called me. I let it ring, then listened to the voicemail 3 times. Claire, sweetheart, I know this is hard. Your father loved you so much. I just need those papers signed so we can settle his affairs properly and move forward. The longer this waits, the more complicated it gets. Call me back when you can. I forwarded the voicemail to Priya and went to bed. The next morning brought 2 things. The first was a call from the assistant district attorney, whose name was Carolyn Marsh. She was brisk and specific and asked questions I hadn't expected, including whether I was aware of any other individuals my stepmother and Marcus might have targeted outside the family. The second was a text from a number I didn't recognize that said only, "You should stop looking." I sent the text to Carolyn's office and changed my locks. What Carolyn's office found over the next 2 weeks began to expand the case in a direction none of us had anticipated. Marcus had not only helped Renee with my father's documents, he had a record in 2 other counties of similar schemes, always involving elderly individuals with health conditions, always entering their lives through romantic relationships or caretaking arrangements, always waiting for the right moment to start moving assets into their own control. The county clerk Beverly had been right to warn us. Renee had called that office the morning after I'd visited, asking what records had been accessed and by whom. The search of Renee's home produced things she hadn't managed to destroy. A dedicated email account under a name that wasn't hers containing correspondence with a pharmacist 2 towns over about medication interactions. Purchase records for a supplement that, at high doses, can interfere with cardiac medications in ways that look unremarkable on a death certificate. A handwritten ledger, in Renee's own careful writing, that listed my father by name alongside dates, dosages, and notes in shorthand that the investigators translated with the help of a toxicologist. The toxicologist's analysis of the exhumed samples confirmed what the recording had already told us. What had appeared to be a natural cardiac event was not natural at all. I was sitting in Priya's office when Carolyn called with that news. Priya watched my face and slid a box of tissues across the desk without saying anything. I don't know how long I sat there. The grief I'd felt at my father's death had been real and complete, and I had thought I understood the shape of it. I had been wrong. There was a different grief underneath it, sharper and older, and it had to do with the fact that he had spent his last months in a house with people who were timing his death like a business transaction. Daniel drove from Columbus that night. He didn't bring anything except himself and a bag of groceries. And he cooked dinner in my apartment, and we sat at the table and talked about our father the way we hadn't been able to at the funeral, which had been Renee's production from start to finish, carefully managed and photographed, and entirely without the stories that actually mattered. Remember when he drove to Cincinnati at 2 a.m. because you called him crying about a bad test score? Daniel said. I was 11. He didn't even tell you he'd done it. He just showed up at school pickup the next day with a box of donuts and didn't say a word about the drive. I laughed, and then I cried, and both felt necessary. Renee was arrested on a Wednesday morning outside the salon she went to every week for a blowout. Marcus was picked up at his apartment in the same hour. The charges, as Carolyn read them to me over the phone, took almost 3 minutes. Fraud in multiple degrees, identity theft, forgery, conspiracy, and, for both of them, homicide. The preliminary hearing drew more press than I had expected. There had been 2 other victims, it turned out, an elderly widower in the next county who had died 18 months ago under circumstances now being reinvestigated, a retired teacher who had survived but lost her savings entirely and was still fighting in civil court when our case gave investigators the thread they needed to pull her file back open. I sat in the courtroom during the arraignment and watched Renee enter in the kind of tailored blazer she always wore, her expression arranged into something composed and wronged. She found my face in the gallery and held my gaze for a moment. I didn't look away. Whatever she had believed about me, that I was the grieving daughter who would sign wherever the yellow tab said, that I was too small and too sad to look closely at anything she understood in that moment, she had been wrong. Her attorney entered a not guilty plea. It didn't hold. The trial lasted 11 days. The recordings were played in their entirety. The toxicologist testified for a full afternoon. Beverly, from the recorder's office, testified about the call she'd received from Renee after our visit. The retired teacher testified about the day she discovered her savings account was empty and how she had assumed it was her own memory, failing her until investigators showed her the wire transfer records. I testified for 3 hours. I described the missing earrings that had made me order the camera. I described the folder of papers and the yellow tabs and the moment I noticed my signature on a document I had never seen. I described sitting at my kitchen table at midnight, watching a clip on my phone, and hearing my stepmother discuss the timing of my father's death in the same tone someone might use to discuss a travel itinerary. Renee's attorney tried to argue that the recording was staged, that I had motive to undermine my stepmother, that grief had made me paranoid and vindictive. He did not have an explanation for the pharmacist's email correspondence, or the handwritten ledger, or the toxicology report. He did not have an explanation for Marcus's prior record or the matching methodology across 3 separate victims. What he had was a thin defense built on the assumption that a jury would prefer a simpler story. They didn't. Guilty on all counts. For Renee, 43 years without the possibility of parole. For Marcus, 31 years. Carolyn called me before the press release went out, which was a kindness I hadn't expected. "You built this case," she said. "The recording was the foundation. Everything else we found because we knew where to look." "My brother helped," I said. "I know. Tell him I said so." The civil component took longer. Priya filed against the estate's fraudulently transferred assets and recovered enough to make the other victims whole, including the retired teacher, whose name was Margaret, and who sent me a handwritten note that I have kept. It says only, "Thank you for looking when you could have looked away. I know what it cost." The pharmacist, who had believed he was supplying supplements to a health-conscious customer, cooperated with investigators and was not charged. His testimony about the specific requests Marcus had made helped establish premeditation in a way that closed the last gaps in the prosecution's timeline. Renee's house sold at auction. The proceeds, after legal fees and restitution disbursements, were placed in a trust administered by Priya's office. My father's actual estate, the one he had intended to leave equally to Daniel and me, was restored through the court. His real will, the one Renee had tried to supersede with forged documents, had been on file with his attorney for 12 years and was exactly what we would have expected from a man who drove 2 hours in the middle of the night because his daughter was upset about a test score. I took a leave of absence from teaching in the spring, not because I had to, but because I needed a week of not being responsible for anyone else. Daniel met me in Asheville, and we hiked trails our father had always talked about visiting and never gotten to, and we ate at restaurants that didn't have anything to do with grief or evidence or courtrooms. On the last evening, we sat on the porch of the rental cabin and watched the mountains go dark in layers, the way they do when the sky still holds light, long after the sun is gone. I thought about the camera on the bookshelf, which I had put up to find out where some earrings had gone, and how it had become the thing that answered a question I hadn't known I was asking. My father had not died of a broken heart. He had been taken. That distinction matters to me, even though I understand some people would say the outcome is the same. It isn't. Knowing the truth means I don't have to carry the grief that would have come from believing he'd simply given up. He hadn't given up. He'd been robbed of the chance to keep going. There's a difference, and I hold on to it. When I got home, there was a message from Margaret, the retired teacher, saying she had started a local group for people who had experienced financial elder abuse and asking if I would be willing to speak at their first meeting. I said yes immediately. I said it before I had time to decide whether I was ready, because some questions answer themselves if you let them. I also ordered a new camera, better model than the first one, cloud backup, 2-week storage, motion detection that distinguishes between shadows and people. I have it aimed at my front door now, not because I expect anything, but because I have learned that documentation is not paranoia. It is simply the practice of taking yourself seriously enough to preserve evidence of your own life. The pearl earrings were in a box in Renee's closet, catalogued with the rest of the recovered property. Priya arranged for them to be returned to me along with the silver serving spoons, which still smelled faintly of the cedar chest where my mother had kept them for 30 years. I wear the earrings to school sometimes, and my students ask if they're real pearls, and I say yes, They belonged to my grandmother, which is what my mother always said when I asked the same question. Some things travel forward with you. Some things you carry and some things carry you, and sometimes, if you were lucky enough to have a father who drove through the night because you were sad, you know the difference. The camera blinked steadily by the door, recording nothing unusual, keeping watch the way people do when they have learned, the hard way, that attention is not a luxury. It is the thing you owe yourself before anyone else can take what's yours. Daniel calls every Sunday. We talk for too long and about nothing important, and it is the best part of my week. Margaret's group meets on the second Thursday of every month. Priya sends updates when there are legal developments. Carolyn's office is still building the case around the second county, and they've found a fourth potential victim, an 80-year-old retired engineer whose accounts were emptied 2 years ago by a caretaker who used the same P.O. box as one of Renee's dissolved LLCs. I will testify again if they need me to. I already said so. The week my father was buried, I couldn't have told you what came next. I could barely drive without pulling over. I couldn't grade papers or plan lessons or remember to eat at regular times. The only thing I could do was sit very still and feel the weight of everything I didn't understand yet. Now I understand more than I ever wanted to. I also understand that understanding is not the same as being okay, and being okay is not the same as being done. And being done is not really something that happens. What happens instead is that you find out what you're made of by watching yourself keep going in the direction that matters, even when you're not entirely sure you can. The camera was just a camera. The recording was just a recording. But I pressed play, and that was the thing that changed everything. And I would do it again without a moment's hesitation, because my father deserved someone who would look when it would have been easier not to. And so, for that matter, did I.